The opening chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran begins in the primordial stasis of the Age of Ancients. This is the narrative genesis of disparity, where the physical architecture of the world was not defined by the crumbling stone of cathedrals, but by the infinite unchanging of the archdragons and the great hollows. Within the gray crags and the fog-bound horizons, the world existed in a state of perfect neutrality. The lore of this era is the lore of the pre-existential void. Its purpose was the establishment of the eternal order, a world without life or death, light or dark. The history of the Age of Ancients is the history of the immortal monopoly, where the archdragons reigned as statues of scale and stone, believing the world was a canvas that would never be painted. This is the tragedy of the gray, proving that perfection is a prison that stifles the possibility of becoming. The lore of the first flame provides the energetic foundation for this chapter's upheaval. Deep within the caverns of the world, the flame spontaneously manifested, introducing the concept of disparity to the void. The lore suggests that the fire was the first sin against the neutrality. Its purpose was the polarization of reality. With the heat came cold, with the light came dark, and with life came death. This reveals the violent purpose of the elemental origin. The flame was a revolution that burned the logic of the dragons to create a place for mortality. This was the era of the first spark. This shows that the history of Dark Souls is a history of the contrast, which defines the value of existence through the inevitability of its loss. The physical environment of the kiln of the first flame in its primordial state provides insight into the atmospheric birth of the fall. This was the cradle of the gods, a subterranean altar where the first hollows crawled from the dark toward the warmth. The lore of the primordial cavern explains that its purpose was the distribution of the Lord souls. From the flame, four distinct essences were claimed, founding the hierarchies that would build and eventually destroy Lordran. This reveals the evolutionary purpose of the discovery. The Lords gained the power to challenge the immortals only by accepting the fragmented nature of the flame. This was the era of the soul claiming. This shows that the history of the Lords is a history of the theft, where the power of the future is stolen from the embers of the earth. The relationship between Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, and the solar hierarchy represents the theocratic ambition within the fall. Gwyn claimed the strongest of the Lord souls, representing the light and the power of the lightning. The lore suggests that Gwyn was the architect of the new order. Its purpose was the systematic eradication of the ancient status quo. By forging a legacy of light, Gwyn sought to replace the chaos of the fire with the structure of the kingdom. This reveals the totalitarian purpose of the solar origin. The god built a world that required his presence to function. This was the era of the sunlight spear. The history of Gwyn is the history of the king, who fears the dark before it even exists. Furthermore, the lore of the Witch of Izalith and the Flame of Life represents the biological ambition within the fall. The witch claimed the soul of life, seeking to master the creative potential of the fire. The lore suggests that life is uncontrollable. Its purpose was the manifestation of the prolific growth. By experimenting with pyromancy and sorcery, the witch sought to engineer a legacy that could outlast the fading of the original spark. This reveals the hubristic purpose of the life soul. The matriarch attempted to imitate the divine creation and birthed the chaos that would consume her daughters. This was the era of the firestorm. This shows that the history of Izalith is a history of the mutation, which turns the sacred into the monstrous. The relationship between Nito, the first of the dead, and the entropy of the fall represents the inevitable conclusion within the narrative. Nito claimed the soul of death, representing the quiet resignation of the end. The lore suggests that death is the foundation of meaning. Its purpose was the enforcement of the mortal limitation. By managing the miasma of disease and rot, Nito ensured that the new world would have a cycle of turnover. This reveals the passive purpose of the death soul. The Gravelord waits at the end of the road, knowing that the light and the life must eventually wither. This was the era of the miasma. The history of Nito is the history of the grave, which gathers the remnants of the lords. The lore of the furtive pygmy and the dark soul represents the subversive redemption of the fall. Unlike the others, the pygmy claimed a fragmented and small soul, representing the darkness and the humanity that grows in the shadows. The lore suggests that the dark is the true legacy. Its purpose was the preparation for the age of man. By splitting the dark soul into countless humanities, the pygmy ensured that the dark could never be truly extinguished. This reveals the stealthy purpose of the human origin. While the lords built castles, the man waited in the abyss for the flame to die. This was the era of the dark sign. This shows that the history of the pygmy is a history of the patience, which inherits the ashes of the great. The act concludes with the violent outbreak of the War of the Ancients, as the lords ascend from the caverns to challenge the archdragons. The purpose of the Dawn of Fire lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of conflict. It shows that peace is stagnation. The lords realize that to exist, they must destroy. The rise of the genocide of the dragons is the first movement of the Lordran lore, proving that in the world of dark souls, creation is not a gift, it is a conquest that is bought with the betrayal of the eternal. The legacy of the first flame in this chapter is the horror of the genesis of disparity. We realize that life was a curse of difference and light was a shadow that Gwyn used to blinded the world to its future. The purpose of the workshop of the flame was to ignite the ego, and the fall was the end of the gray, as the lords raised their weapons and unleashed the lightning upon the scales of the dragons. Hearing the screams of the immortals breaking the silence for the first time, they understand that the history of Lordran is the history of the burning, a burning that consumes the past and leaves the future to smolder in the dark. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran records the genetic treachery that tipped the scales of the world. This is the narrative breaking of the lineage, where the physical architecture of the prehistoric era, the everlasting scales of the archdragons, was pierced by the intellectual malice of an outcast. Within the storm of lightning and the rain of stone, the lords waged a war of extinction against the ancient sovereigns. The lore of this era is the lore of the defective immortal. Its purpose was the shattered unity of the dragonflight. The history of the Great War is the history of the pale drake's envy, where Seth the Scaleless traded the souls of his brethren for a library and a duke's title. This is the tragedy of the mutation, proving that knowledge is a blade that cuts deeper when wielded by one who hates his origin. The lore of the scaleless mutation provides the biological foundation for this chapter's betrayal. Born without the stone scales that granted his kin immortality, Seth was a glitched god, a frail and blind anomaly in a world of perfection. The lore suggests that the absence of scales was the presence of ambition. Its purpose was the birth of intellectual superiority through physical inadequacy. Because Seth could not be eternal by nature, he sought to be eternal through sorcery and logistics. This reveals the resentful purpose of the betrayal. Seth did not ally with Gwyn out of justice. He destroyed the dragons because he could not endure being the only one who could die. This was the era of the exposed flesh. This shows that the history of Seth is a history of the compensation, which sells the world to hide its scars. The physical environment of the battlefield of the ancients provides insight into the tactical despair of the fall. This was a landscape of shattered pillars, where the lightning of Gwyn peeled the armor of the immortals, while the miasma of Nito rotted their inners. The lore of the dragon-slaying strategy explains that its purpose was the application of Seth's secrets. Seth revealed to the lords that the scales were the key to the immortality, and that lightning was the frequency that cracked them. This reveals the information warfare purpose of the alliance. The lords won not through bravery, but through espionage. This was the era of the Great Peeling. This shows that the history of the war is a history of the exploit, where the mighty fall to the secret leaked by the weak. The relationship between Gwyn's lightning and the architectural demolition represents the solar dominance within the fall. Gwyn heaved bolts of sunlight to tear the wings from the sky, converting the rulers of the air into corpse mounds on the ground. The lore suggests that lightning is the antithesis of the ancient. Its purpose was the violent introduction of time. By breaking the eternal scales, Gwyn forced the dragons into the stream of entropy, making them subject to death. This reveals the theocratic purpose of the solar assault. The god standardized the world by removing anything that refused to wither. This was the era of the thundering sky. The history of the sunlight spear is the history of the clock, which starts the countdown to the end. Furthermore, the lore of the Witch of Izalith and the firestorms represents the scorched earth policy within the fall. The witch and her daughters of chaos weaved great firestorms to burn the arch trees that supported the dragon's nests. The lore suggests that fire is the eraser of history. Its purpose was the destruction of the biological infrastructure. By incinerating the habitat, the witch ensured that the dragons had no place to retreat. This reveals the ecological purpose of the chaos. The lords burned the past to make soil for the future. This was the era of the blackened trunk. This shows that the history of the firestorm is a history of the purge, which clears the canvas with flame. The relationship between Niddo's miasma and the biological decay represents the finality of the grave within the fall. Niddo unleashed a cloud of death and disease that infected the wounded dragons, ensuring that even a scratch from a sunlight spear became a terminal condition. The lore suggests that Nito was the cleanup crew of the gods. Its purpose was the prevention of the dragon's recovery. This reveals the cruel purpose of the miasma. The lords wanted the dragons to suffer the indignity of sickness before they succumbed to the dark. This was the era of the rotting scale. The history of the miasma is the history of the infection, which proves that even the eternal can be soiled. The lore of the Duke's archives and the price of betrayal represents the institutionalization of the sin within the fall. For his contribution to the genocide, Gwyn granted Seth ennoblement and a massive library near the capital of Anerlondo. The lore suggests that the Duke is a sanctioned madman. Its purpose was the containment of the dragon's remaining power. Within these crystal-clad walls, Seth began his descent into insanity, experimenting on the maidens and creating the sorceries that would define the Age of Fire. This reveals the Faustian purpose of the Duke's status. Gwyn bought the future with the sanity of the traitor. This was the era of the Crystal Soul Spear. This shows that the history of the archives is a history of the obsession, where the scientist becomes the monster he helped to kill. The act concludes with the silent observation of the last archdragon, hidden in the Ash Lake, realizing that the age of its kind has ended. The purpose of the betrayal of Sethlore was to be the universal exposure of the fragility of immortality. It shows that nothing is indestructible if someone knows where the seam is. The rise of the Age of Fire is the final movement of the dragon lore, proving that in the world of Lordran, unity is not a shield, it is a target that is shattered by the avarice of the individual. The legacy of Seth in this chapter is the horror of the scaleless treachery. We realize that victory was a chemical theft and immortality was a fable that the Pale Drake rewrote to suit his loneliness. The purpose of the workshop of the archives was to catalog the slaughter, and the fall was the foreclosure of the ancient world. As Seth retreats into his crystal solitude and stares at the bones of his family, hearing the cheers of the Gwyn's knights ringing through the canyons, They understand that the history of the betrayal is the history of the void, a void that consumes the brother and leaves the Duke to rot in his magnificence. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran shifts from the smoldering ruins of the Dragon War to the blinding radiance of the City of the Gods. This is the narrative architectural apotheosis, where the physical architecture of the world was manifested in ivory stone and golden spines to cement the divine right of the lords. Within the soaring buttresses and immense cathedrals, Gwyn witnesses the transition from warlord to sovereign. The lore of this era is the lore of the Golden Delusion. Its purpose was the institutionalization of fear through awe. The history of Aner Londo is the history of the solar monopoly, where the gods engineered a metropolis so imposing that it convinced the mortals below that the Age of Fire would never end. This is the tragedy of the monument, proving that greatness is often a mask worn to hide the fragility of the flame. The lore of the solar theocracy provides the sociological foundation for this chapter's dominance. After the extinction of the dragons, Gwyn established himself as the Sun King, claiming the heavens as his personal domain. The lore suggests that Aner Londo was a weapon of perspective. Its purpose was the psychological subjugation of the human undercity. By building the city on a plateau bathed in eternal sunlight, the gods positioned themselves as sources of life, making the fading of the fire seem impossible. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the divine capital. It was a gilded cage built to ensure that the dark remained a myth told in the pits of New Londo. This was the era of the high walls. This shows that the history of Aner Londo is a history of the mirage, which blinds the worshipper to the shadow gathering at the gate. The physical environment of the Cathedral of Gwyn provides insight into the atmospheric oppression of the fall. This is a shrine to the ego filled with statues of the deities, representing the gods' need to be remembered as perfect. The lore of the Hall of Heroes explains that its purpose was the mythologizing of the lords. As the human pilgrims walked these echoing floors, they were forced to feel their smallness, reinforcing the idea that they were blessed to serve such titan beings. This reveals the propagandistic purpose of the architecture. The gods used scale to replace merit. This was the era of the Colossus. This shows that the history of the cathedral is a history of the stage, where the lords perform divinity to keep the darkness at bay. The relationship between the four knights of Gwyn and the martial enforcement represents the lethal shield within the fall. To protect the illusion of the god city, Gwyn selected four exemplars: Ornstein the Dragonslayer, Artorias the Abyss Walker, Hawkeye Goff, and Lord's Blade Kieran. The lore suggests that the knights were the border of the divine. Its purpose was the specialized suppression of emerging threats. From hunting the remaining dragons to stalking the shadows of the abyss, these four guaranteed that the peace of Aner Londo was maintained through exceptional violence. This reveals the instrumental purpose of the Guardians. The gods required executioners to uphold the image of the holy. This was the era of the lion and the wolf. This shows that the history of the four knights is a history of the sacrifice, where the individual is converted into a symbol. Furthermore, the lore of the Silver Knights and the automation of order represents the industrialization of the guard within the fall. These stone-cold soldiers, adorned in polished silver, represented the static and unmoving will of Gwyn. The lore suggests that the Silver Knight is a uniform. Its purpose was the manifestation of the inevitable defense. By manning every battlement and corridor, they ensured that Aner Londo felt like a living fortress that never slept. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the divine security. The gods don't negotiate, they post sentries. This was the era of the Silver Spear. This shows that the history of the Silver Knights is a history of the shell, which stays standing long after the soul has fled. The relationship between the Guinevere projection and the illusion of fertility represents the synthetic hope within the fall. In the later years, it is revealed that the sunlight and the princess were illusions created by Gwyn, the dark moon god. The lore suggests that the sun is a lie. Its purpose was the hiding of the city's desertion. By projecting a glowing bust of the Princess of Sunlight, the ruins of Anerlando were hidden from the undead pilgrims, preventing a panic that would extinguish the last embers of faith. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the illusion. The gods abandoned the city, but they left the light on to trick the mortals into dying for a corpse. This was the era of the Golden Veil. The history of Guinevere is the history of the phantom, which nourishes the delusion of the dying. The lore of the painted world of Ariamis and the divine exile represents the censorship of the aberrant within the fall. Hidden within the cathedral was a giant painting that acted as a dimension of banishment for things the gods feared. The lore suggests that the paint is a gallows. Its purpose was the isolation of the peculiar crossbreed, Priscilla, and the occult embers. By tucking the evidence of their fear inside a canvas, the lords ensured that their narrative of absolute purity remained unchallenged. This reveals the secretive purpose of the exile. In the city of the gods, difference is a crime that is locked away in a work of art. This was the era of the snowy prison. This shows that the history of the painting is a history of the exclusion, which turns the unwanted into a legend. The act concludes with the silent observation of Anerlando at sunset, as the first shadows creep across the marble, realizing that the city is already empty. The purpose of the founding of Anerlando lore was to be the universal exposure of the artificial divinity. It shows that splendor is temporary. The lords realize that they have built a cenotaph, not a kingdom. The rise of the fading of the fire is the final movement of the Anerlando lore, proving that in the world of Lordran, authority is not a fact, it is an atmosphere that is cited by the desperation of the abandoned. The legacy of the Golden City in this chapter is the horror of the Golden Delusion. We realize that safety was a theatrical lie and light was a blindfold that Gwyn used to drown the world in eternal mourning. The purpose of the workshop of the sun was to cultivate the worship, and the fall was the foreclosure of the divine estate. As the shadows lengthen and the gods flee their palaces in the night, hearing the echoes of their own footsteps in the silent streets, they understand that the history of Anerlando is the history of the mask, a mask that cracks the moment the sun finally sets. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran descends into the molten tragedy of the lost Izalith. This is the narrative biological catastrophe, where the physical architecture of the ancient city, once a vibrant civilization of stone and fire, was warped into a living hell of pulsing roots and lava-choked ruin. Within the hissing vents and distorted temples, the Witch of Izalith witnesses the final corruption of her ambition. The lore of this era is the lore of the counterfeit spark. Its purpose was the scientific resurrection of the fading light. The history of the souring is the history of the birth of chaos, where a lord attempted to play God and engineered a plague that rewrote the DNA of an entire race. This is the tragedy of the maternal sin, proving that life is a wildfire that consumes the hand that feeds it. The lore of the chaos flame provides the alchemical foundation for this chapter's horror. As the first flame began to drip into ash, the Witch of Izalith used her Lord Soul to incubate a new fire. The lore suggests that the imitation was a mutation. Its purpose was the forced perpetuation of the Age of Fire. Instead of a controlled hearth, the witch birthed a sentient tumor of magma and branch that swallowed her body and shattered her soul. This reveals the hubristic purpose of the artificial creation. The witch traded order for chaos because she refused to accept the night. This was the era of the souring. This shows that the history of Izalith is a history of the experiment, which turns the creator into a prisoner of their own formula. The physical environment of Lost Izalith provides insight into the geological despair of the fall. This is a graveyard of the pious submerged in boiling sludge, representing the destructive nature of unchecked vitality. The lore of the Molten City explains that its purpose was the manifestation of the witch's agony. As the chaos flame erupted, the architecture melted, fused with the roots of the arch trees, and became a tangled labyrinth where space and time were secondary to heat. This reveals the entropic purpose of the souring. The city didn't just die, it digested itself. This was the era of the eternal burn. This shows that the history of Lost Izalith is a history of the smolder, which leaves the world a cinder before the dark even arrives. The relationship between the daughters of chaos and the familial decay represents the personal necrosis within the fall. The witch's offspring, the 7 daughters, were transformed by the chaos, becoming monsters of fire and silk. The lore suggests that the family is a sacrifice. Its purpose was the demonstration of the collateral damage of ambition. From the fair lady's silent suffering to Quilana's exile, the souring stripped them of their humanity, leaving only remnants of love trapped in arachnid frames. This reveals the tragic purpose of the demonic mutation. The children inherited the debt of the mother. This was the era of the chaos bug. This shows that the history of the daughters is a history of the morning, which weeps lava instead of tears. Furthermore, the lore of the birth of the demons and the new taxonomy represents the evolutionary nightmare within the fall. The chaos flame spawned an entirely new species, demons, who operated outside the order of the gods. The lore suggests that the demon is a mistake. Its purpose was the ecological replacement of the human race. These beings of fire and horn represented a world that didn't need the lords or the sun. This reveals the threatening purpose of the chaos spawn. Gwyn feared them because they were fire he couldn't control. This was the era of the Taurus demon. This shows that the history of the demon is a history of the anomaly, which claims the basement of the world. The relationship between ceaseless discharge and the perpetual agony represents the burden of the firstborn within the fall. The only son of the witch was transformed into a massive, molten titan, condemned to bleed lava to soothe the sores of his shattered flesh. The lore suggests that the brother is a sentinel of pain. Its purpose was the protection of the grave of his sisters. By guarding the ruins, he ensured that the souring was never disturbed. This reveals the miserable purpose of the demonic guard. The power of chaos only offers longevity at the price of suffering. This was the era of the lava fall. The history of Ceaseless is the history of the wound, which never closes. The lore of the pyromancy paradox and the intellectual split represents the sacred versus profane within the fall. The fire sorcery of the witch evolved into pyromancy, the art of human fire handling. The lore suggests that pyromancy is a primitive truth. Its purpose was the democratization of the flame. While the gods used lightning to rule, the humans learned to hold the fire in their hands, showing that the legacy of Izalith would survive as a tool for the undead. This reveals the resilient purpose of the souring's outcome. The mother's failure gave the children a weapon. This was the era of the Great Swamp. This shows that the history of pyromancy is a history of the spark, which outlives the bonfire. The act concludes with the silent observation of the bed of chaos, watching its roots choke the remains of the throne room, realizing that the flame it guards is no longer divine. The purpose of the souring of Izalith lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the artificial life. It shows that preservation can be deadlier than death. The lords realize that they have birthed a cancer in the foundation of Lordran. The rise of the demonic invasion is the final movement of the Izalith lore, proving that in the world of dark souls, motherhood is not a blessing, it is a curse that is written in the blood of the innocent. The legacy of lost Izalith in this chapter is the horror of the counterfeit spark. We realize that ambition was a biological weapon and family was a tether that the witch used to anchor the chaos to the stone. The purpose of the workshop of the bed was to recreate the sun, and the fall was the mutation of the soul. As the lava consumes the statues and the demons rise from the sludge, hearing the screams of the witch echoing through the roots, they understand that the history of Izalith is the history of the tumor, a tumor that grows in the heart of the Lord and leaves the world to burn in the dark. The 5th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran descends into the watery tomb of the human capital. This is the narrative submerged betrayal, where the physical architecture of a thriving city, once a beacon of human culture and progress, was drowned beneath a great flood to contain a spreading darkness. Within the sunken streets and waterlogged cathedrals, the citizens of New Londo witnessed the final corruption of their rulers. The lore of this era is the lore of the primordial temptation. Its purpose was the seduction of the human ego by the abyss. The history of the drowning is the history of the life drain, where 4 kings traded their duty for the art of sucking souls from their subjects. This is the tragedy of the necessary genocide, proving that safety is a cold weight that crushes the innocent to suffocate the sin. The lore of the 4 kings and the shard of the Lord's soul provides the political foundation for this chapter's fall. Originally, Gwyn granted a shard of his own Lord's soul to the 4 leaders of New Londo, representing his trust in human leadership. The lore suggests that the gift was a vulnerability. Its purpose was the integration of humanity into the solar hierarchy. However, without the divine oversight of the gods, the kings became susceptible to the whispers of the Darkstalker Koth. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the abyssal seduction. The serpent offered the power of life drain, turning the protectors into predators who viewed their people as fuel. This was the era of the Darkwraith. This shows that the history of New Londo is a history of the hunger, which devours the city from the inside out. The physical environment of the sunken city provides insight into the stagnant despair of the fall. This is a city of ghosts choked with silt and bone, representing the erasure of human achievement. The lore of the Great Seal explains that its purpose was the tactical containment of the abyss. When the Darkwraiths began their rampage, the gods determined that the city could not be saved. The 3 sealers, Ingward, Yulva, and Lothrek's companion, were tasked with opening the sluice gates to drown every man, woman, and child along with the darkness. This reveals the calculative purpose of the flood. In the eyes of the gods, the life of a city is expendable compared to the threat of the void. This was the era of the rising tide. This shows that the history of the sealers is a history of the guilt, which wears a crimson mask to hide the blood. The relationship between the Darkwraiths and the parasitic evolution represents the predatory nature within the fall. The Knights of New Londo were transformed into skeletal stalkers equipped with the Dark Hand, representing the absolute consumption of the soul. The lore suggests that the Darkwraith is the final form of avarice. Its purpose was the harvest of humanity for the Dark Lord. By sucking the life from the living, they intended to accelerate the fading of the first flame. This reveals the antagonistic purpose of the abyssal arts. The abyss doesn't build, it extracts. This was the era of the Shattered Eye. This shows that the history of the Darkwraith is a history of the void, which leaves the world hollow and cold. Furthermore, the lore of the ghosts and the trapped agony represents the spiritual stasis within the fall. Because the drowning was so sudden and violent, the souls of the citizens were unable to pass on, manifesting as vengeful spirits that haunt the ruins. The lore suggests that the ghost is a memory of injustice. Its purpose was the permanent documentation of the betrayal. These screaming apparitions attack any living being who enters the city, seeking to share the suffocation they endured. This reveals the tortured purpose of the sunken souls. The city remembers the weight of the water and the silence of the gods. This was the era of the transient curse. This shows that the history of the ghosts is a history of the trauma, which binds the victim to the scene of the crime. The relationship between the four kings and the abyssal void represents the fragmentation of authority within the fall. Within the abyss itself, the kings discarded their humanity and became amorphous giants of purple fog and blade. The lore suggests that the kings are sovereigns of nothing. Its purpose was the guardianship of the dark soul's influence. By residing in the darkness, they became the final barrier for anyone seeking to challenge the cycle. This reveals the ironclad purpose of the king's transformation. The Lord Soul was corrupted into a tether that anchored the abyss to the physical world. This was the era of the Dark Hand. The history of the kings is the history of the descent, which turns the crown into a chain. The lore of the transient curse and the requirement of death represents the isolation of the site within the fall. To battle the ghosts, a traveler must become dead or cursed, proving that life has no place in New Londo. The lore suggests that the curse is a passport. Its purpose was the filtration of the worthy. Only those willing to touch death could witness the truth of the drowning. This reveals the metaphorical purpose of the Ghost Blade. To enter the history of the drowned, you must sacrifice your connection to the sun. This was the era of the Jagged Blade. This shows that the history of the curse is a history of the price, which demands the soul as entry. The act concludes with the silent observation of Ingward, the last sealer, watching the water from the rooftop of the cathedral, realizing that he guards a graveyard of his own making. The purpose of the drowning of New Londo lore was to be the universal exposure of the sacrifice of the subject. It shows that order drowns the weak. The gods realize that they have buried their shame in the basement of Lordran. The rise of the abyssal spread is the final movement of the New Londo lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, leadership is not a service, it is a decision that is written in the lungs of the drowning. The legacy of New Londo in this chapter is the horror of the submerged betrayal. We realize that safety was a violent illusion and water was a shroud that the sealers used to silence the cries of the people. The purpose of the workshop of the seal was to contain the inevitable, and the fall was the burial of the human soul. As the water rests cold and still over the statues, and the four kings wait in the dark, hearing the echoes of the sluice gates rusting shut, they understand that the history of New Londo is the history of the weight, a weight that pulls the kingdom down and leaves the slayer to dive into the sin. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran moves from the urban sins of New Londo to the foundational decay of the world's pillars. This is the narrative cosmic entropy, where the physical architecture of reality, the colossal arch trees that support the surface world, is revealed as a crumbling skeleton. Within the vertical desolation of the Great Hollow and the eternal silence of the Ash Lake, we witness the exhaustion of the divine engine. The lore of this era is the lore of the dying spark. Its purpose was the observation of the unavoidable regression. The history of the fading is the history of the solar god's panic, where Gwyn realized that sunlight was a finite resource, and that the Age of Fire was losing its war against the natural gravity of the dark. This is the tragedy of the star, proving that power is a burning debt that demands the total consumption of the owner. The lore of the arch trees and the universal pedestal provides the structural foundation for this chapter's reveal. Hidden beneath the roots of the Lordran forest, the Great Hollow acts as a bypass to the basement of the world. The lore suggests that the Hollow is a corridor of truth. Its purpose was the demonstration of the world's precariousness. By descending through the warping wood and fungal rot, one discovers that the kingdom of the gods is perched on twisted and fragile remnants of an older era. This reveals the precarious purpose of the world's design. The gods built their empire on a living scaffold that is now petrifying as the flame dies. This was the era of the sinking root. This shows that the history of the hollow is a history of the underpinning, which fails the heavens long before the stars go out. The physical environment of the ash lake provides insight into the primordial despair of the fall. This is a sea of stillness, where the world returns to its original state of gray and mist, representing the victory of stasis. The lore of the eternal shore explains that its purpose was the final refuge of the ancient truth. Here, the water and the sand wait for the age of fire to dissolve, proving that the Gwyn's era was merely a flicker in the infinite gray. This reveals the humbling purpose of the lake's existence. The lords never truly conquered the world. They only postponed the inevitability of its quiet. This was the era of the white ash. This shows that the history of the ash lake is a history of the horizon, which envelopes the winner and the loser alike. The relationship between the everlasting dragon and the remnant of immortality represents the dormant resistance within the fall. Hidden in the reeds of the lake, a stone dragon sits in eternal meditation, representing the fact that the genocide was incomplete. The lore suggests that the dragon is a witness. Its purpose was the silent preservation of the pre-flame logic. By staying undeclared in the war, it outlasted the lords who killed its brothers, waiting for the dark to reset the balance. This reveals the patient purpose of the survivor. The past never dies, it sleeps beneath the present. This was the era of the path of the dragon. This shows that the history of the dragon is a history of the rebound, which prepares to regrow once the fire becomes dust. Furthermore, the lore of the fading sun and the weakening souls represents the energetic atrophy within the fall. As the flame dwindled, the souls of the lords lost their potency, and the light in Aner Londo began to flicker. The lore suggests that the sun is a parasite of the soul. Its purpose was the consumption of the divinity to maintain the illusion. This reveals the vampiric purpose of the solar age. The fire requires fuel, and as the humans stopped worshipping, the gods began to starve. This was the era of the dimming horizon. This shows that the history of the flame is a history of the hunger, which demands more than the god can give. The relationship between Gwyn's departure and the abandonment of the throne represents the final decision within the fall. Realizing that the Age of Fire was terminally ill, Gwyn divided his power among his children and departed for the kiln. The lore suggests that the departure was a suicide. Its purpose was the desperate sacrifice to restart the cycle. By leaving the city of the gods to burn himself as kindling, Gwyn turned his lord soul into a faggot for the flame. This reveals the terrified purpose of the great lord. He feared the dark so much that he chose to become cinder rather than witness the night. This was the era of the Silent City. The history of the departure is the history of the abdication, which leaves the world in the hands of Gwyndolin and the illusion. The lore of the Way of White and the cult of the Fuel represents the clerical desperation within the fall. The Church of Gwyn created the Undead mission to funnel human souls toward the first flame. The lore suggests that faith is a logistics chain. Its purpose was the industrialization of human sacrifice. By telling the undead that they were chosen to succeed Gwyn, the Church ensured a steady supply of kindling to keep the sun alive. This reveals the predatory purpose of the undead prophecy. The gods used hope to herd the victims into the fire. This was the era of the pilgrimage. This shows that the history of the church is a history of the slaughterhouse, which glorifies the incineration of the individual. The act concludes with the silent observation of Gwyn, stepping into the mouth of the kiln, realizing that he is no longer a king, but fuel. The purpose of the fading of the first flame lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the divine preservation. It shows that immortality is a leaking vessel, The lords realize that they have consumed the future to buy a minute of the past. The rise of the linking of the fire is the final movement of the fading lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, salvation is not a rescue, it is a stoking of the furnace with the charred remains of the divine. The legacy of the Great Hollow and the Ash Lake in this chapter is the horror of the cosmic entropy. We realize that stability was a warping root and light was a screaming burn that Gwyn used to seal the fate of the universe. The purpose of the workshop of the Ash was to wait for the end, and the fall was the exhaustion of the solar soul. As the flame hisses and shrinks into a glowing heap of charcoal, and the shadows claim the corners of the world, hearing the rumble of the arch trees shifting in the dark, they understand that the history of the fading is the history of the Ash, an ash that covers the throne and reminds the Slayer that the sun is nothing but a star that ran out of will. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran ascends into the refractive nightmare of the Duke's archives. This is the narrative intellectual decomposition, where the physical architecture of the Great Library, a citadel of knowledge, was encrusted with stalactites of moonlight and fractured by the paranoia of its master. Within the turning bookcases and crystal forests, Seth the Scaleless witnesses the final collapse of his reason. The lore of this era is the lore of the blindness of insight. Its purpose was the obsessive search for an artificial immortality. The history of the madness is the history of the crystallized ego, where a lord sacrificed the sanity of a kingdom to secure a fragile invulnerability that cost him his soul. This is the tragedy of the scholar, proving that truth is a prism that splinters the identity of the observer. The lore of the primordial crystal provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's horror. Stolen from the archdragons during the Great War, this artifact granted Seth a proxy immortality, linking his life to an external object. The lore suggests that the crystal was a parasite of the mind. Its purpose was the creation of a static existence. Because Seth lacked the natural scales of his kin, he outsourced his invincibility to a geometric anchor, making him immune to death, but susceptible to obsession. This reveals the neurotic purpose of the crystal's power. The Duke exchanged his perspective for longevity, entering a loop of research that had no exit. This was the era of the blue light. This shows that the history of Seth is a history of the crutch, which breaks the user as much as it saves them. The physical environment of the Duke's archives provides insight into the systemic despair of the fall. This is a panopticon of paper, where the god's history is stored in silent stacks, representing the stagnation of wisdom. The lore of the moving staircase explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the Duke's confusion. As Seth lost his sight and his mind, the library rearranged itself into a vertical puzzle, ensuring that intruders were lost in the geometry of his thoughts. This reveals the labyrinthine purpose of the archives. The knowledge was no longer a bridge, it was a wall. This was the era of the channeler. This shows that the history of the archives is a history of the secrecy, which turns the classroom into a tomb. The relationship between the channelers and the surveillance of the maidens represents the clinical cruelty within the fall. Seth's six-eyed sorcerers, the channelers, traveled across Lordran to abduct human maidens for research. The lore suggests that the maiden is a biological vessel. Its purpose was the investigation of the soul's resilience. Within the prison tower of the archives, these women were transformed into Pisaka, mutilated blue cephalopods that wept in the dark. This reveals the ghoulish purpose of the crystallization. The Duke sought to understand the immortality of the soul by breaking the bodies of the innocent. This was the era of the oral decoy. This shows that the history of the channelers is a history of the predation, which uses magic as a hook. Furthermore, the lore of the moonlight sorcery and the corruption of logic represents the intellectual decay within the fall. Seth birthed the schools of sorcery, but his later spells were jagged and destructive, reflecting his increasing violence. The lore suggests that magic is a reflection of the caster. Its purpose was the defense of the crystal monopoly. By filling the crystal caves with invisible paths and man-eating golems, Seth proved that logic had devolved into hostility. This reveals the misanthropic purpose of the sorcery's evolution. The scholar no longer wanted to teach, he wanted to erase. This was the era of the white dragon breath. The relationship between the crystal soldiers and the loss of will represents the mineral enslavement within the fall. The guards of the archives were infected by the crystal, becoming mindless automatons with lethal precision. The lore suggests that the crystal is a viral thought. Its purpose was the automation of the Duke's defense. These soldiers lost their humanity to the sparkle of the moonlight, showing that the archives consumed everything that stayed too long. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the crystal growth. The Duke surrounded himself with statues because he could not trust the living. This was the era of the glinting armor. The history of the soldiers is the history of the shell, which protects the lie with glass. The lore of the crystal caves and the boundary of reality represents the physical distortion within the fall. Beneath the library, the natural caverns were overwritten by magical crystals that gravity refused to claim. The lore suggests that the cave is the Duke's true home. Its purpose was the rejection of the material laws. In the cave, sight was deceptive and footing was faith, reflecting how far Seth had driven himself from the world of the lords. This reveals the schizoid purpose of the environment. To kill the Duke, the Slayer had to walk on nothing. This was the era of the invisible platform. This shows that the history of the cave is a history of the mirage, which turns the earth into a dream. The act concludes with the silent observation of Seth the Scaleless, howling in his chamber of crystals, realizing that he has become blind to the truth he sought. The purpose of the madness of Seth lore was to be the universal exposure of the arrogance of the intellect. It shows that knowledge without empathy is madness. The lords realize that they have granted a title to a disaster. The rise of the crystal corruption is the final movement of the Seth lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, genius is not a gift, it is a cancer that is fed by the isolation of the immortal. The legacy of the Duke's archives in this chapter is the horror of the blindness of insight. We realize that wisdom was a refractive scream and immortality was a glass casket that Seth used to suffocate the history of his people. The purpose of the workshop of the crystal was to solve the soul, and the fall was the fracturing of the mind. As the crystals crackle and grow through the books and the maidens wail in their cells, hearing the laughter of the channelers echoing through the hallways, they understand that the history of the madness is the history of the reflection, a reflection that distorts the god and leaves the slayer to shatter the vision. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran steps into the chronological wound of Owalasile. This is the narrative catastrophic transgression, where the physical architecture of a sophisticated sorceress city was liquefied into a nightmare of shadows and bloated flesh. Within the sunken town and the chasm of the abyss, the citizens of Owalasile witness the primal consequence of disturbing the dead. The lore of this era is the lore of the primordial humanity. Its purpose was the seduction of the intellectual curiosity by the void. The history of the siege is the history of the Father's awakening, where Manus, the primeval man, was exhumed and tortured by a sorceress elite until his grief exploded into a black hole of humanity. This is the tragedy of the unbridled hunger, proving that enlightenment is a match that ignites the powder keg of the abyss. The lore of Manus, Father of the Abyss, provides the biological foundation for this chapter's horror. Encouraged by the serpent Koth, the sorcerers of Owalasile dug into the ancient grave of a pygmy lord, inciting a humanity that had gone wild. The lore suggests that Manus is the incarnation of emotional entropy, Its purpose was the retribution of the suppressed dark soul. As his humanity ran wild, it manifested as stretching limbs and endless eyes, representing the infinite longing for a lost past. This reveals the visceral purpose of the abyssal spread. The dark didn't just kill, it invited the victim into a permanent deformation. This was the era of the primeval scream. This shows that the history of Manus is a history of the morning, which turns the human into a void that consumes the light. The physical environment of the Owalasile township provides insight into the mutated despair of the fall. This is a vertical city tilted into the earth, where the stone softens into sludge and the houses melt into maws. The lore of the bloathead mutation explains that its purpose was the biological manifestation of the abyss's influence. The citizens found their heads expanding with red eyes and jagged teeth, reflecting the ugliness of their own avarice. This reveals the ironic purpose of the township's ruin. The sophisticated sorcerers were reduced to whimpering beasts by the very power they sought to categorize. This was the era of the dark bead. This shows that the history of Owalasile is a history of the exposure, which strips the ego to reveal the monster. The relationship between Artorias the Abyss Walker and the noble failure represents the shattered heroism within the fall. To stem the tide of the dark, Gwyn dispatched his strongest knight to confront the abyss. The lore suggests that Artorias was the sacrificial lamb of the gods. Its purpose was the demonstration of the abyss's invincibility. Despite his unyielding will, Artorias succumbed to the darkness, breaking his arm to shield his wolf, Sif, and losing his soul to the void. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the knight's corruption. In the abyss, bravery is not a shield, it is a flavor that the darkness enjoys. This was the era of the wolf ring. This shows that the history of Artorias is a history of the eclipse, which swallows the warrior and leaves only the stain. Furthermore, the lore of the great wolf Sif and the eternal vigil represents the mournful loyalty of the fall. Left behind in a barrier of light, Sif witnessed the fall of his master, growing to enormous size to guard the Abyss Walker's grave and the art of abyss walking. The lore suggests that the wolf is the purest survivor. Its purpose was the prevention of further human transgression. By fighting any traveler who sought the covenant, Sif protected the world from repeating the sin of Owalasile. This reveals the poignant purpose of the grave defense. The beast understood the danger better than the kings. This was the era of the great sword. This shows that the history of Sif is a history of the promise, which lasts until the end of the world. The relationship between Marvelous Chester and the temporal displacement represents the cross-dimensional hunger of the fall. Drawn into the abyss from a different era, Chester represented the universal reach of the father's grief. The lore suggests that the abyss is a chronological magnet. Its purpose was the gathering of the disparate sins. By pulling strangers into the past, Manus sought to find his lost pendant, proving that the dark disregards the rules of time. This reveals the desperate purpose of the time travel. The abyss is a searching hand that reaches across the ages to reclaim what was stolen. This was the era of the sniper crossbow. The history of Chester is the history of the outcast, who observes the end from the sidelines. The lore of the Black Dragon Calamite and the Natural Calamity represents the persistent threat within the fall. Even Aenir Londo dared not provoke the dragon that prowled the royal woods of Owalasile. The lore suggests that Calamite is the eye of disaster. Its purpose was the illustration of the god's impotence. While the abyss consumed the inside, the dragon hunted the outside, showing that the Order of Gwyn was collapsing on all fronts. This reveals the predatory purpose of the dragon's presence. The gods no longer ruled the sky. This was the era of the Obsidian Greatsword. This shows that the history of Calamite is a history of the terror, which hovers above the ruin. The act concludes with the silent observation of Knight Artorias, dragging his shattered form through the Colosseum, realizing that he has become the herald of the void he vowed to destroy. The purpose of the Siege of Owalasile lore was to be the universal exposure of the inevitability of the dark. It shows that light fades. The Lords realize that the abyss is not an enemy to be fought, but a truth to be accepted. The rise of the abyssal infection is the final movement of the Owalasile lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, heroism is not a solution, it is a sacrifice that is drowned in the ocean of humanity. The legacy of Owalasile in this chapter is the horror of the primordial humanity. We realize that progress was a blind grave robbing and magic was a lure that the sorcerers used to summon their own extinction. The purpose of the workshop of the chasm was to awaken the Father, and the fall was the corruption of the ideal. As the black fog envelopes the statues and Artorias roars in agony, hearing the laughter of the serpent echoing through the void, they understand that the history of the siege is the history of the shadow, a shadow that stretches from the past and leaves the slayer to put the hero to rest. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran descends into the absolute sensory deprivation of the Tomb of the Giants. This is the narrative biological finality, where the physical architecture of the world is no longer composed of gold or stone, but of the collective remains of the Titan era. Within the suffocating blackness and the labyrinth of colossal ribcages, Gravelord Nito witnesses the final stagnation of his domain. The lore of this era is the lore of the patient decay. Its purpose was the management of the global turnover of souls. The history of the tomb is the history of the first of the dead's silence, where the Master of Death realized that the Age of Fire had become a zombie civilization, refusing to die even as its organs rotted. This is the tragedy of the interrupted rest, proving that death is a gift that the Lords of Lordran stole from the people to extend their dying glow. The lore of Nito, the first of the dead, provides the entropic foundation for this chapter's isolation. As one of the original four, Nito administered the miasma of death from the altar of the grave. The lore suggests that Nito is the natural auditor of the soul. His purpose was the recycling of life into the earth. By donating much of his Lord's soul to death, Nito ensured that the cycle would remove the old to make way for the new. This reveals the merciful purpose of the Gravelord's original intent. The god understood that existence requires an exit. This was the era of the sarcophagus. This shows that the history of Nito is a history of the boundary, which protects the world from the horror of infinite stagnation. The physical environment of the Tomb of the Giants provides insight into the geological nihilism of the fall. This is a basement of bone located beneath the catacombs, representing the scale of the mortality required to build the kingdom above. The lore of the sightless chasm explains that its purpose was the isolation of the physical remnant. In the pitch black, space collapses, and the only guide is the glow of the skulls, forcing the traveler to face the anonymity of extinction. This reveals the egalitarian purpose of the tomb's darkness. In the end, the giant and the human share the same dirt. This was the era of the skull lantern. This shows that the history of the tomb is a history of the truth, which reveals that the gods built their high walls on a foundation of corpses. The relationship between the pinwheel and the theft of the rites represents the parasitic desperation within the fall. A necromancer stole the power of the Gravelord, the rite of kindling, to attempt to resurrect his lost family. The lore suggests that the pinwheel is the pathetic shadow of ambition. Its purpose was the demonstration of the fragmentation of divine authority. By stealing from a sleeping god, Pinwheel proved that the lords were no longer feared, merely harvested. This reveals the tragic purpose of the theft. In the failing world, love becomes a ghoulish experiment that mingles the father, mother, and child into a single deformity. This was the era of the mask of the father. This shows that the history of Pinwheel is a history of the grief, which corrupts the laws of nature to chase a ghost. Furthermore, the lore of the skeleton beasts and the bestial death represents the evolutionary regression within the fall. In the deepest pits, the remains of giant servants devolved into four-legged monstrosities of bone, representing the loss of the civilized soul. The lore suggests that the skeleton beast is anatomy without identity. Its purpose was the automatic guarding of the grave. These creatures lacked reason or purpose beyond violence, showing that when the flame fades, the humanoid form returns to the predatory impulse. This was the era of the Bone Tower. This shows that the history of the beast is a history of the decay, which strips the servant of his dignity. The relationship between the rites of kindling and the manipulation of the undead represents the clerical cannibalism within the fall. The rites allowed undead to strengthen bonfires by sacrificing humanity, linking the survival of the individual to the perpetuation of the god system. The lore suggests that the rite is a tax on the soul. Its purpose was the extraction of value from the dying. This reveals the cruel purpose of the kindling. The gods taught the victims to burn their own essence to light a room that belongs to the enemy. This was the era of the Estus flask. The history of the rite is the history of the consumption, which feeds the great with the guts of the small. The lore of the Gravelord servant and the viral misery represents the spiritual infection within the fall. Even in his resignation, Niddo's eye of death spread disaster and curse across the worlds of other travelers. The lore suggests that the Gravelord is a passive pestilence. Its purpose was the enforcement of the inevitable end. By curse-binding other realms, Niddo ensured that the stagnation of Lordran was shared by all, proving that death cannot be ignored. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the invasion. The grave reaches out to claim those who think they are safe in the sun. This was the era of the Gravelord sword dance. The act concludes with the silent observation of Niddo, slumbering in his giant sarcophagus, realizing that he has become the warden of a world that refuses to arrive at his gate. The purpose of the Tomb of the Giants lore was to be the universal exposure of the theft of the final rest. It shows that life without death is hell. The lords realize that they have broken the natural law. The rise of the necromantic plague is the final movement of the tomb lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, immortality is not a triumph. It is a cancer that piles the bones high, but never clears the air. The legacy of the Gravelord in this chapter is the horror of the patient decay. We realize that peace was a silent molder and rest was a violated concept that the lords used to anchor their power to the earth. The purpose of the workshop of the grave was to archive the end, and the fall was the stagnation of the cycle. As the miasma chokes the caverns and the skeletons click through the dark, hearing the rattle of the Lord's soul weakening in the chest of the dead, they understand that the history of the tomb is the history of the weight, a weight that crushes the future and leaves the slayer to settle the account with the scythe. The final chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the fall of Lordran reaches the Ashen Absolute at the center of the world. This is the narrative terminal paradox, where the physical architecture of the world's power, the kiln of the first flame, has eroded into a white desert of calcified history. Within the leaning pillars and the spiral of ash, the chosen undead witnesses the final deconstruction of the divine mandate. The lore of this era is the lore of the burden of the air. Its purpose was the resolution of the Age of Fire through total consumption. The history of the kiln is the history of the Hollow King, where Gwyn, once the Lord of Sunlight, is reduced to a mindless guardian of a dying hearth. This is the tragedy of the cycle, proving that victory in Lordran is not a crown, but a sentence to be incinerated for a world that has already forgotten your name. The lore of the Lord of Cinder provides the psychological foundation for this final confrontation. No longer the radiant sovereign who slew the dragons, Gwyn exists as a charred shell, driven by a single primal instinct to protect the flame from the dark. The lore suggests that the cinder is the final stage of authority. Its purpose was the illustration of the cost of the preservation. By burning his soul, Gwyn extended the age, but lost his identity, becoming the very hollow he feared. This reveals the ironic purpose of the final boss. The Slayer doesn't fight a god, he mercy kills a battery. This was the era of the Sooty sword. This shows that the history of Gwyn is a history of the sacrifice, which turns the creator into the obstacle. The physical environment of the kiln provides insight into the aesthetic of the end of the fall. This is a vacuum of time where the sand is actually the pulverized remains of the cities and people that served the fire. The lore of the Ash Desert explains that its purpose was the physical manifestation of the entropy. Here, the sun is a dim eclipse, and the wind carries the dust of millions, proving that the great kingdom of Lordran has already returned to the gray. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the environment. The fire doesn't save the world, it grinds it into cinders to keep itself lit. This was the era of the calcified root. This shows that the history of the kiln is a history of the residue, which buries the hero in the waste of the gods. The relationship between the Black Knights and the final escort represents the lingering duty within the fall. These charred soldiers, whose armor was burned black when Gwyn linked the fire, stalk the kiln as disembodied spirits. The lore suggests that the Black Knight is a statue of loyalty. Its purpose was the enforcement of the king's final isolation. Even in death, they guard the path to the flame, showing that the military legacy of Einerlando ends in purposeless violence. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the Guardians. The gods leave a trail of burned men to mark the way to the gallows. This was the era of the Scorched Plate. This shows that the history of the Black Knights is a history of the aftermath, which haunts the ashes of the victory. Furthermore, the lore of the linking of the fire and the false continuity represents the delusion of the successor within the fall. If the chosen undead offers their soul, the flame explodes and consumes them, beginning a new age of fire that is destined to fade faster than the last. The lore suggests that the linking is a stalling tactic. Its purpose was the maintenance of the status quo at the cost of the future. By succeeding Gwyn, the hero becomes a cog in a system that despises humans. This reveals the tragic purpose of the choice. Success is suicide, and salvation is a delay of the inevitable. This was the era of the repeating sin. The relationship between the Age of Dark and the natural order represents the revolutionary silence within the fall. If the chosen undead walks away from the flame, the light dies, and the world enters the Age of Man. The lore suggests that the dark is the inherent truth. Its purpose was the restoration of the human agency. By extinguishing the fire, the hero ends the divine tyranny and allows the world to sleep, even if that sleep is cold and full of abyssal uncertainty. This reveals the subversive purpose of the departure. The Slayer rejects the script of the gods to witness the night. This was the era of the Dark Lord. The history of the Dark is the history of the awakening, which requires the death of the sun. The lore of the primordial serpents and the narrative split represents the manipulation of the legacy within the fall. Frampt wishes for the fire to be linked, while Koth snares for the Age of Dark. The lore suggests that the serpent is the architect of the choice. Its purpose was the utilization of the undead as a tool for cosmic change. This reveals the vampiric purpose of the serpents. Whether the flame burns or dies, the serpents remain in the mud, feasting on the remains of the lords. This was the era of the whispered prophecy. This shows that the history of the serpents is a history of the parasite, which lives in the gap between the cycles. The act concludes with the fading of the final theme, Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, as the screen turns black, leaving the user with the sound of crackling embers or absolute silence. The purpose of the kiln and the cinder lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the end. It shows that legacy is a weight. The lords realize that they have written a history that nobody is left to read. The rise of the new world is the final movement of the Lordran lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, victory is not a resolution, it is the choice to burn or to go quietly into the dark. The legacy of the first flame in this final chapter is the horror of the terminal paradox. We realize that light was a screaming requirement and divinity was a hollow mask that Gwyn used to anchor the world to a corpse. The purpose of the workshop of the kiln was to forge the conclusion, and the fall was the exhaustion of the universal soul. As the ashes settle over the throne and the slayer stands alone at the center of the void, hearing the last sigh of the fire dying in the wind, they understand that the history of Lordran is the history of the spark, a spark that defined the light but left the world to inherit the shadow.